thanks for doing this. I've been thinking about work
Mm-hmm.
these days over the last few months, really,
Mm-hmm.
especially trying to see how I could bring down to earth some of the stuff I've learned online over the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the big intellectual puzzles that I had, I feel I've been more or less settled. There's a few thinkers I've identified who answered a lot of the questions I had for myself. So I'm looking for ways to apply it. And even like some of the thinkers that I found gave me good intellectual solutions to problems I had would point then to like concrete applications of those ideas. So
Mm-hmm.
in
Could you give an
Schindler,
example? Okay, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
like Schindler
Sure.
in his book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason,
Mm-hmm.
he makes the case that when the philosopher reaches knowledge of the forms,
Mm-hmm.
he will want to come back down the cave to help others learn about the same things that the philosopher has learned.
Mm-hmm.
So you get this in Schindler, and there's a funny story also in John's Gospel that is similar. I don't know if you have noticed it, or rather noticed the parallel with Schindler, but like it's in John's Gospel at some point. I think it's after Jesus has ridden into Jerusalem. Like people have acclaimed him and everything, and he's going to the temple to worship for the Feast of the Tabernacles, I believe. And while he's there, in the text it says that there's a few Greeks who want to speak with him. So Greek Jews, presumably, because they're going to the temple. Um, but it says that they don't speak directly to Jesus. They speak to two apostles. I think it's Philip and James. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
The two apostles would then go speak to Jesus. So the setup you have there is like you have two Greeks, so people who were probably familiar with Plato somehow, who go up to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was on a mountain too. So like they're coming out of the cave, you can say, and they're seeing the Logos
Mm-hmm.
himself, which is Jesus. So it's like the philosopher coming out of Plato's cave.
Mm-hmm.
And then much like in Plato's allegory of the cave, the philosopher has to then come back down the cave when he has seen the Logos. Then what Jesus tells the Greeks there is that if a grain of wheat um, falls into the ground and dies, then it will bear much fruit.
Mm-hmm.
But if it doesn't, then it will remain alone. So, and then Jesus says a few other things, but the basic idea seems to be the same kind of thing that Plato is saying in the Republic, where if you do really reach contact with the Logos, then you will want to come back down.
Mm-hmm.
If you reach like very high metaphysical knowledge, if it's true, then you will want to come back down and you will be able to bear fruit
Mm-hmm.
with it too. Otherwise, you're just going to remain alone
Mm-hmm.
with your ideas. So, yeah, because of all this, I've been trying to think more about, okay, well, if what I've been learning online is true, then it should bear fruit in my life concretely and
Mm-hmm.
in the
Mm-hmm.
lives of others around me. So that's why I've been thinking about work, among other things. I know that
Mm-hmm.
some people in the symbolic world community have had problems with this too, where they want to be just writing or reading or discussing about symbolism, but like most of those people have ordinary lives, and like in theory, because symbolism is about connecting heaven and earth, it should apply to everything, including ordinary life.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I thought about work in particular, and I really like that book by Scott Hahn, Ordinary Work, Extraordinary Grace: My Spiritual Journey in Opus Dei, because it does talk about the symbolism of work
Mm-hmm.
there. And I've already talked a bit about this with some friends, and I recorded a French podcast about it with Jonathan. I don't know if you've watched this one.
Yeah, I watched it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm
Yeah.
not going to repeat all
Mm-hmm.
the arguments we discussed there. But before I go further, like, did you have any follow-ups already from watching this? Stuff you disagreed with or stuff you'd like to add upon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found that it didn't get down to very, very concrete applications. And one of the things that I slightly disagreed with in what Jonathan was suggesting, that that fabrication and the effort to make things, that was something that only transpires after the fall, after
Mhm.
original sin. Um, the founder of Opus Dei, Saint Jose Maria, liked to remind people that that work is mentioned in the Genesis before the fall, when he's talking about, but maybe it's not the kind of work that Jonathan was thinking about, because it's more refers more to cultivating the garden, and but I would say that that kind of work in a way implies fabrication, because what are you going to cultivate the garden with? You need tools, and if you're going to use tools, you're going to have to make them, right?
This is interesting because it does, like, I remember Jonathan making the distinction between work and art, or art and technique. Apparently, they're the like Latin and Greek roots for the same thing, and he separates them from work, which, like, and it's one point that Anne makes. Work in Hebrew, the word that's used in Genesis is the same word that's used to describe the liturgical work of the Levites of the temple. But it does look like the kind of technique that happens after the fall, like it's often associated with Cain and his descendants. Actually, it's directly associated with Cain and his descendants. And like overall, there's going to be something like a very coherent pattern, I think, that you can make with this. Even like in extra biblical traditions, like in the Book of Enoch, which was apparently fairly known back in the days, there's other like technical knowledge that also comes from Cain's line, like even makeup, or I don't remember all the different technologies that they use, but it looks like in the garden, the kind of work that Adam and Eve were doing, it's hard to imagine what it was concretely. Like I can almost only picture it as liturgy, as like a liturgical kind of work, or something that they could only do with their hands. It's hard to see what that could be, but we're naked with no tools. It does say explicitly, I think, that Cain was the first one. No, Cain, Tubal Cain. I think one of Cain's descendants was the first one to make weapons and tools of, as in which metal, but tools of metal.
But in a way, I don't know if this has been thought about, because I'm not as up as you are probably on the exegetical literature. But it seems to me that like Cain is doing the kind of work that Adam, like the cultivating of the garden, like he's farming, whereas Abel is doing something rather different, right?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Like not a garden sort of stuff, right? Cain is doing, like, he's growing things from the soil, and that's, you know, agriculture, which seems more like what Adam and Eve would have been doing, like in a garden setting. But of course, it's done. I think it's the relationship. It suggests it's the relationship between like what you're doing and God, which is the big difference, right? In other words, that if what you're doing is oriented towards God and towards God's glory and living a life of worship and thanksgiving, then it can be anything. But if you're not doing that, which is you know what the Genesis account suggests about Cain, that he was keeping for himself, he was doing it for himself, right, and not offering the best of his produce to God. Well, then there's something wrong with that, right? So I don't know, that's what I would because and there's the big danger with technological knowledge is that because it involves increasing our power over the earth, that it tends to turn into kind of self-glorification, right? Somebody's showing me a video the other day about bionics, right? And all the and the person presenting it was a TED talk. The person presenting the talk was a professor who had lost both legs, but he's professor at MIT, so he has at his disposal all the resources, in electronics, computing, and etc. And the talk was almost sounded like that this technology was going to be the savior of the world. It was going to eliminate like disability, and he was even going as far as saying that mental health issues like depression and things like that would be something that would be solvable by well, that's that's sort of self-glorification, exalting in your own power over creation, rather than giving homage to God through through creation, right? And like one of the things that struck me in watching that video was like this person doesn't recognize that they're trying to imitate like natural limbs, and they're with all of the power that they have at their disposal, they're not able to do it as good as nature does, as good as God's nature does, right? But you're getting closer and closer. But the goal is to get something as good as the original. Well, they would like to do even better, right? Which is, but they're, when you think of the way that a natural limb operates, it's absolutely perfect, right? Well, perfect for many, as far as something material is concerned.
Yeah. It's interesting thinking back, like about what Adam and Eve were doing in the garden, because I think it says they had dominion over, like, of course, like all the vegetation, the trees, but also the animals. So it looks like what Cain and Abel were doing after the fall, Adam and Eve were doing in some way before the fall, because they had dominion both over the animals, so this is more Abel, and also over the vegetation, which is more Cain. And then like things split between Cain and Abel, and then obviously things got worse. But as you said, with technology, like it seemed like we can see this clear narrative where Cain has to like go further into the earth to take care of the vegetation, and I think it's also into that by just what came before, when God tells Adam that the earth is going to resist him. Now it's going to be harder to make things grow, and then after the fall, then Cain will kill Abel, and then it's going to compound, it's going to get bigger, because Cain is a vagabond on the earth, so like he is wandering, and then to protect himself, he's going to build a city. So Adam and Eve had to build like clothing for themselves, and God gave them clothing, so like a protection from a world that is not hostile. Then Cain has to build a city to protect himself, because he's even further from the garden, you can say. And then Cain's descendants will build technology. And then eventually there's going to be a flood. After the flood, like right after, you have the Tower of Babel. So like people again trying to use technology to not get flooded again, like didn't get the lesson. So they try to like protect themselves absolutely, rather than making the right sacrifices to God. But then it's interesting because technology starts to like be flipped to be used positively, because then Noah will use technology like building a ship, which is a craft. It's an art. So then technology is still something that happens, let's say, as a consequence of the fall, but now it's as a way to, let's say, keep contact with God in a world that has gone far from God. And there's a few stories like this in the Bible, and the ultimate one is with Christ, who is a tecton, who is a technician, who builds the ultimate ark. You can see it as the cross, you can see it as the church, which is also a boat. So it seems like it's a way for God to reach lower into the earth, you could say, which is a place where humanity had to go after the fall. So technology is sort of both a consequence of the fall and something positive, as it turns out. Like the incarnation, you can say, maybe. Like there's people debating whether the incarnation would have happened anyway, but like the way it's described, it seems natural to say that it happened as a result of the fall, but that it's also the greatest thing that ever happened. So like Christianity does those things. So I mean, I agree with what you see with the technology. Like seems to like create a kind of spiral, like we see in Cain's line, and also that it's not necessarily negative. It can be used for positive work, like what's happening in the garden, like happens at the temple. And like Christ did also.
Yeah. But this, I found very interesting, like the fact that the same word is used for work and for liturgy, and basically, like the vocation of um, of humankind is to convert work into liturgy, into adoration, right? And whereby that work becomes prayer, right? It becomes that's the spirit that Scott Hand is talking about there, right?
Yeah.
That and in that case, well, then technology does not it's not an obstacle between man and God. It's actually a channel, right? And it's a very good thing, right? That so the practical question then becomes, well, like how does one achieve that? And I think Hand talks about like the importance of trying to unite everything that you do to the Mass, right? Which is the supreme act of liturgy, so that it becomes united with Christ. And then I think that also helps you to make sense of the arduous aspects of work in the post original sin regime, right? So that that becomes the way of identifying ourselves with the work of redemption that Christ did on the cross, which was also arduous, right? And so it gives a meaning to that dimension of work, which can be purely negative, and it is for many people who hear people talk about their work. Sometimes you get the impression that they're only working so as to be able to retire, right? And that's very opposed to, I think, the way that God wants people to work, right? He wants the work to be something that even the arduous aspects of it take on a meaning because we can unite them to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, right? And that's the basic, like that's the center of the liturgy, right? And so then it's offered up along with Christ's sacrifice to God the Father for the salvation of the world, right? Which turns it into something like something transcendent and something that has meaning, and it also makes the effort and all of that worthwhile, right? And it makes it, because it gives it meaning. Otherwise, it's just it's kind of an unfortunate, like you have to work to have money to be able to live, but you would like to not have to work or not have to, right? Because of the unpleasant and the arduous aspect of it, right?
Or at best it becomes a practice to do something else, which is something that I stressed more when I spoke with Jonathan, that like anything that we do is going to be about connecting heaven and earth somehow, about like building something, connecting things together and so on. So you do learn skills that you can then apply elsewhere, but still you get the question, well, then why? Like you work to be able to do like higher kinds of work, but like when does that ever become something that is good and not just work? Let's say you can like just transfer the question, let's say, to a higher level. But as you said, it seems to get resolved it seems like you can resolve it ultimately in God. And about sacrifice, Hans talks a lot about this in the book. He doesn't use the language of heaven and earth, left, right, the kind of symbolism that I've been using speaking with Jonathan. But right away, he will talk about the relationship between work and sacrifice, which you can see already pretty clearly in the Old Testament, in the Exodus. He makes a really good point that like we tend to remember only the 10 Commandments, but like if you look at the different laws and instructions that we get in Leviticus and Exodus, a lot of it is about like how to concretely make sacrifices to God. And like how to worship at the temple and what the priest should wear and the architecture of the whole thing. Like it's very like work heavy. And he explains that this is about us learning to turn our attention to the highest. So we do liturgical work where we sacrifice the best things that we have as a way to like teach us that the best that we have should be turned to God. So we burn the first fruits of our flocks as a way to offer them to the highest, and it really does shape our attention. Like if we do make these big sacrifices, it's going to ripple out in the rest of our lives, where we know that we should aim for the highest ultimately, and obviously, like this will be taken to its extreme in the sacrifice that Christ does on the cross, and then like it's very mysterious, so I can't really understand this, but to the best of my understanding, one way to explain it to people is what the liturgy that Christ performed in Holy Week, like solved all of the problems that you can see that were set up in the Old Testament, especially in the fall. And like this sacrifice that he did for the church, I think it's easier to see how he sacrificed himself for the people he was responsible for, because he healed all the divisions, he exposed the mistakes and so on. Like he saved us from death, right? So it's easy to see how Christ sacrificed himself for the people below him, so for all of creation. And in doing that, it's also a sacrifice that he does to God. It's the best thing that he could have done for his father. And like in general, I think the best thing that a child can do for their parent is to do like is to be a great parent themselves. Like if a parent can see their child like doing great in the world, like including parenting, so doing the job of the parent even better than the parent itself, then it's like the highest sacrifice that you can make to your parents. So it seems to be what Christ is doing. And it has to do with attention again. Like Christ was always deflecting what he was doing to the Father. Like everything was good. He's saying, oh, I'm just doing the will of my Father and so on. So he didn't try to take anything upon himself. He tried to just make his life a perfect sacrifice for the Father and to save creation. And it looks like it's the same thing that the Levites were supposed to be doing also in the Old Testament. We're supposed to bring all the best that we have and turn it to God. And like by this continuum that we have between liturgical work and olive work, it's something that we can do all the time. Like if we do any given thing, but we offer it as a sacrifice where we're ultimately doing this for the highest good possible, then you get this hierarchy where any work that you do, something like picking up something on the floor to clean it, or taking care of your family, or having a discussion with someone who is in trouble, or whatever, all of those things can be, if they're done for the highest good, then they become liturgy at their level.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And that has, that has practical consequences for the way that you're going to try to do the thing, right? So you're going to do it as best you can with all the human limitations that you have, because in the same way as like the priest they offered the best of the flock with the like the Paschal lamb had to be without blemish, right? Well, the same thing for if you're going to offer your work to God, well, you want to make it as perfect as possible, right? So and there you have so that means like taking care of all the little details, if it's a work or a job where you're serving other people, right? Really giving them good service, and at the same time like smiling and trying to be pleasant, and also realizing that you have to like Christ is offering himself up for the world, for the other people, that you also have to keep other people in mind in your work, and you can offer it for them. And also if you're usually going to be working with other people as well, well, you want to be asking God for graces for them, right? The people that you're working with at the same time, right? So it turns, it's right. It turns anything, even the smallest task, like cleaning up a room or something like that, you could do it if you're doing it for the highest purpose, well, it turns it into something wonderful in a way, right? And it's things that you can do every day and all the time, right? So it's it makes a huge difference. Yeah.
And like what I find really great about this vision is that it seems like you can connect everything together in this hierarchy if you always try to orient any given situation towards its good. Like then all the goods can be nested in the highest good, which is going to be Christ's sacrifice on the cross. And like it also can come back down. And as I said earlier, like if you can really connect it to the highest, it should bear like concrete fruit when ideas are brought back down to whatever level you're at. And it's not something that I've talked a lot about yet, but I've been trying to think about examples because you're not the only one who mentioned to me, like after those videos I did with Jonathan and Derek, that like we didn't go very much into technical details. But so I've been trying to think about it before, and so in the same way that whenever we're doing anything, we're trying to turn it towards the good. We have a bunch of possibilities before us. There's a lot of stuff we could be doing. And it takes a lot of finesse to be able to do the good in that situation. And I think that Christ did it at the highest possible level in the incarnation. So it gives us like a map at the highest level possible, like the most widely applicable map, you can say, of how to do the good in general. So we should be able to take the patterns that we find in Christ's life and apply them to any given situation. And that's sort of the work that Jonathan has been doing with symbolism. He's trying to like take any phenomenon and trying to see its symbolism and then hopefully get something valuable by using that same kind of pattern, but looking for its analog in Christ's story. So let's say one that I've been thinking about especially is the right hand and left hand symbolism. So in Christ's story, you can see that in a few places, notably in Saint Peter and Saint Paul, who are the right hand and left hand of Christ. You can see it in the iconography, and Jonathan has talked a lot about this, but like the basic idea is that Saint Peter is the right hand, the one who like stays, you can say, like close to the center, the apostle to the Jews, who has the keys, like direct power over who is bound and who is unbound, who is also the head of the apostles. It's like you have all this symbolism of the right hand associated with Peter for good and for worse. Like he's also the one with the sins of the right hand, so the sins of pride, of saying like you don't have to go die. So you have this right hand symbolism in Peter, and conversely in Saint Paul you have left hand symbolism where he's the apostle to the Gentiles, the one who goes out far, who does wild stuff, who makes himself all things to all people, who is also a Roman, so he is like not as close to the inside as the ones who are like fully Jews. So, and you see this in iconography, like here in the chapel, we see it too. Like we have Saint Peter and Saint Paul again. So, like Saint Peter is with the sword, with like the weapon at a distance.
It's also the instrument of his martyrdom.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Do you remember how Saint Peter was killed?
He was crucified upside down.
Oh, I think this one would take a long time to get into, but the fact that Saint Peter was like his head was Saint Paul, sorry, that his head was cut out. I think as probably again to do with wildness, with going further, like the same death as John the Baptist was also on the left hand. Whereas Mary is often on the right hand, and Saint John the Baptist on the left hand. So anyway, like we have this right hand, left hand symbolism in Christ's story, and you can look through the Gospels and see like many different interactions of this. Well, the Acts of the Apostles, I should say rather, because Saint Paul wasn't quite there yet. And anyway, like when it means that when, let's say, we go to Mass, or when we read the Bible, when we look at like when we meditate on all those traditions, it is shaping in general our perception of right hand, left hand symbolism, and then this will have concrete consequences throughout our lives. There's our John Vervaeke talks about this sometimes. Like it's pretty well known in cognitive science, something called implicit learning. So humans are really good at picking up on patterns that we can't explain fully consciously. And there's funny experiments about this. Like you can, maybe you know those because you're a linguist. Like you give people a series of letters that were generated using some weird algorithm. So there will be some patterns in there, but they look mostly random. But what's interesting is if you tell people, like you give them, let's say, a series of letters like this, and then you ask them to guess like whichever of those next 5 possibilities is most likely to complete the sequence that you just saw, people are able to guess better than chance the right one, but they have no idea why. And if you ask them to give an explanation for why they pick one, they're totally wrong. Like either it's just false, or it even makes them worse if they try to use it. So like we pick up intuitively on patterns that we can't explain like verbally. And liturgy probably does this also to a large extent, where we go to liturgy and we're transformed by the patterns that we see. Even if most of them we can't explain. And it's pretty common. I think people start going to liturgy and they're transformed.
Well, the meanings of a lot of words are like that. The dictionary defines them by using other words, but if you ask somebody to define a tree or whatever, right, they won't be able to do it very well in general, and yet they're perfectly capable of talking about trees. And so it's this implicit knowledge or tacit knowledge, right? That you can't really verbalize very well, because you're not consciously, like, you grasp it, but you can't phrase it in conscious terms. And I'm sure the liturgy has all kinds of things like that. Where you're so the right and the left, then you've been looking at that.
And then
St. Peter, St. Paul, right?
Because what's great is that this is such a universal category that everything that we do is going to be about navigating this left hand, right hand symbolism, even if we don't notice. And like we can think about work very concretely. So I have a friend of mine who's a programmer as well, and he asked me, like, how do you map out like left hand, right hand symbolism when you're doing programming? And I think it actually shows up at many different layers. But one place where you can see it, I think, pretty quickly is like when you're trying to write something new, like a piece of code to do something. When you're actually like typing and creating something, that's more of the left hand, where you're going like extrinsically, like you're creating something new. But then, like, if you just go out and like write 100 lines of code, like it's probably not going to work right away. Like you need to test it. So testing it is being more the right hand, like seeing what you can bring in and what you need to cut out. So what happens there is that you have this interesting balance, because you don't want to be like writing 2 lines and then testing every single time, like you change a tiny little thing, like being too right hand, because if you do this, like it's going to take forever. Your code may be very, very robust, but it's going to take so long that like you're going to be just a dead skeleton, basically, like a dead structure. But if on the other side you go like you write too much code too fast, too left hand, you're not going to have any structure. You're going to have tons of mistakes. It's not going to be a coherent structure together. So you need to balance left hand and right hand. So let's say you and lots of this is going to happen intuitively, and it depends on the context too. Like sometimes maybe you're doing something that you're pretty confident in. Maybe you go and you write like 30 lines of code, and then you test it, and then you're fine. And then you work on something more difficult, and then I'm just going to write like 5 lines, and then I'm going to test it. So like you have this interplay between left hand and right hand,
how much
like
you let yourself, how much you go, right? How far you go.
And I think that like this, I don't think we notice it very much, but when we're doing this balance between left and right, if we like are steeped into the Christian stories of Saint Peter and Saint Paul, like we're going to be doing this balancing differently. We're going to have been influenced by what happens in the examples that we learn about in liturgy. Sometimes it's going to be explicit and sometimes not. Sometimes I think it could also, especially if we do the abstract task of reflecting on symbolism, on like, why is Saint Peter doing this kind of thing? Like, why when I see art of like Saint Peter and Saint Paul, they're always like represented this way. Like, if we try to think about like what's the frame to think about this stuff, then we can probably use that frame at very like practical levels when I'm doing programming with. So it can give me a frame for some things, and then it's going to influence my finesse to navigate all kinds of issues. So I think it's an example of how I can take something very high, like from the symbolism of events in Christ's life and apply them to something very low when I'm just like doing my mundane, ordinary programming
Right.
work.
Yeah. Where you have this combination between intuition and something more structured, right? Which is it's interesting. Like, yeah, St. Paul is outside. Well, he's he's outside the 12. He's outside the structural aspect of the church. Yet he becomes integrated as like he's considered an apostle, right?
Yeah.
On the same.
He says
and
he's
he,
an aborted apostle.
yeah, right. But you have this both of these elements that reminds me of something that G.K. Chesterton liked to observe about Catholicism. He said it wasn't a religion of this or that, but it was a religion of both this and that, right? And so it's both the left and the right, St. Peter and St. Paul. And he used to talk about like that Christ is both God and man. The church is in favor of both celibacy and marriage.
Yeah.
And both of them are seen as good. So all of these things that look sort of, well, another one is the church is in favor of preaches the universal destination of all the goods of the earth that belong to everybody, but at the same time private property, right? It looked like like private property is more the right hand, and the universal, capitalism and the right, and the universal destination of the goods is more like a socialist kind of thing. And in Christianity, you have both, right, are affirmed, right?
Yeah.
So it's it's not always obvious how you're going to reconcile those, right?
Yeah.
But like your example of programming is interesting in that you see that you need both.
Yeah.
Right. You can't just, if you just let yourself loose and go with the left hand, you're going to get something incoherent. Right. And if you get you just use the right hand, where you're going to be so paralyzed, you're not going to be able to create anything. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So you need both. You need to know how to apply them in counterpoint, right? So that they work together and they don't work against one another. But when you do, then it works, right?
Yeah.
That's it's a wonderful. Yeah.
It's a lot about finesse. It seems like, I think initially when I started thinking about this, I was sort of expecting, I think, yes, no answers. Like I was kind of expecting that, okay, I can take like something I'm doing concretely at work and then map it to something from the Bible and then get a straightforward answer.
Right.
But I don't think that's exactly how it works, because as you said, Christianity is often more about like navigating opposites in a way that like can take in both of them. Sometimes there's like clear no answers, but they're often obvious enough that you could probably have figured it out in your original context anyway. But what we see, I think, rather is, I think you see this in the variety of saints, like how different saints can be, like starting from Saint Peter and Saint Paul. But, like I think it just goes down through the ages, where you have very wild characters, like Saint Francis of Assisi, who does wild stuff that no one else could like do well, because it takes a lot of finesse to do the kinds of things that Saint Francis was doing. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have some saints who are much more like straight edge.
St. Thomas Aquinas,
for example, like very rigorous.
Right.
They're very different saints. But like the church doesn't like tell you have to be this one or you have to be that one. It's rather like you have to be oriented towards the good, and then like it's gonna take like uniting opposites around you to navigate towards this. And like it seems like what we're trying to do is like to achieve this kind of balance, like displace to follow the logos, you can say, between opposites. And like,
because we're following the logos in a contingent world, right? So you have to have the logos is what sort of guides you, or whatever. If you don't have that, you're lost. But at the same time, it's not a straight path, right? So it's a bit like climbing a mountain, right? If you try to go straight, you're just going to fall off it, probably.
Yeah,
right.
And we
So
start at different places too.
yeah,
if
you
it's
start at
normal.
different places, but you know, you have to know how to navigate obstacles and take advantage of, but always with like the logos or your final destination in mind, right? It's a bit like was it a linguist, a French linguist he used to compare logic and natural languages using that sort of image, saying that logic is like the straight line, but natural language is the sinuous path, right? That maybe arrives at the same destination, but does it by a very different way. And like that's what life is like, right? It's not the straight logical line where it's always always up and always pointed in the same direction. You have some cases in order to get there, you have to go in another direction, right? Some cases you might even have to go down a little bit to be able to take advantage, to avoid an obstacle and come back. So I don't know, like if that's kind of the right and the left, like the logic.
It can be, it can be, I think. The structure and the exploration, you can say, can probably be there. And there's many of those mappings. I think probably in that case, that's probably the closest one, because there's other oppositions that you can see Jesus navigating in the incarnation. One I find quite interesting is the one between the active and the contemplative. So you can see this in a few pairs of characters again. Like you can see it in Saint Peter and Saint John. So Saint John the Apostle, where like in Saint John's Gospel, especially, it's pretty clear. Saint Peter is like the visible rock on which Jesus founds the church. He's the chief of the apostles. He is like Christ tells him explicitly that Peter is going to be leading and he's going to lay down his life for the flock. And like because he's the active one, he's also like a bit too rash sometimes. Like he'll like sprint ahead and like fall in the water. He will deny Christ.
Tell me across the cross on the water. Right?
He's very active. So like sometimes he acts too rashly. On the other side, Saint John is hidden. Like he's not even named in his own gospel. Like he just describes himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And like he is described as like he doesn't act too much often, but he's often an intermediate for others. Like during the Last Supper, there's an episode where Christ tells the apostles that he's going to be betrayed by one of the apostles. So what the apostles do is they don't just ask straight away. Well, first, the first one to really ask is Peter, because he's the chief of the apostles. But then he doesn't ask Christ directly.
Yes, John. Yeah,
he asks John, and then John asks Christ. John is laying on Christ. But so there's a few episodes like this, and there's other opposites like that in John's Gospel, especially. You have this story with Mary and Martha again, where Mary is more John, the contemplative, and Martha is more the active, like Peter. And then when Lazarus dies, it's really interesting because Martha comes first to see Jesus. And like she kind of complains, and Jesus tells her that he's gonna come back to life, but Martha doesn't really get it, and she's kind of mad, it seems. And then she goes to see her sister, Mary, who had stayed at home, and then she goes to see Christ. She weeps. She's like John. She's like the contemplative.
But she says exactly the same thing as her sister.
But she cries.
But she cries.
and then Jesus cries too, and then he brings Lazarus back. So again, it seems like you have the active going through the contemplative to reach the logos, to reach God, and then something will happen.
No, it's exactly. I mean, this makes me think of like in the church is entrusted not only to Peter, but also to Mary. And so it's not just like the church is a family, if you want, right? Okay, Peter's the head, but there's there's a mother involved too, right? Which is kind of like John.
Yeah.
Well, you find both of them at the foot of the cross. And my suspicion is that one of the main reasons why John is there is because he was close to Mary. Because you see Christ entrusts Mary to his protection at the foot of the cross, right? So like I think he was already very close to her, and that's very natural. He was the youngest of the apostles, and it would be normal that Mary would have had a special affection for him, taking care of him. So you have this, like the maternal, I guess that would correspond to the left-hand side, and your right-left symbolism, probably.
I don't know if I would map Mary. Well, Mary is more, I think, on the right. Yeah, and same.
I resist that a bit for some reason, but
I think this one, like, it's not as clear. I think it's more the head and the heart in this case, where you can see the right.
But the heart is more left.
The right? Sorry, the heart.
Yeah.
Well,
what's on the left-hand side of your body?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can maybe do it, but the symbolism isn't going to be as clear cut, I think, if you try to map them this way. I think it's if you compare, let's say, Mary and Peter, or Mary or Peter and John, I think it's going to be the pattern that comes out more is the active and the contemplative. Or you can also say maybe the right hand and the heart. The contemplative is the one that's more hidden. And there's even a few direct mentions of the heart. So like Saint John was laying on Christ's heart. Saint Mary was pondering things in her heart. And there's, like, of course, devotions to the heart of Mary. Like there's
and also to the heart of Jesus.
Yeah. So there's a few connections. I think the fact that both Mary and John were hidden, the fact that they were both monastics too. So they were both virgins, whereas Peter was active one, was married, was more in the world. Like both Mary and John will die of natural causes. And John was the only apostle to die of natural causes. The other ones were all martyred. Like the active ones were martyred. So I think the categories of left and right wouldn't fit as well with this. I think it's clearer to think of the active and the contemplative. But then, and one of the reasons why I think it's better this way is that if you try to apply it, it's all so much clearer because like, again, I think that's something I can do very concretely, even like at work, even doing something very technical and concrete, like programming. Like if I just try to always be active and try stuff, like it's gonna work to an extent, but I'm not gonna have very deep ideas, and sometimes I'm just gonna get stuck. So like sometimes I need to like stop my activity and just contemplate for a little bit, try to have access to the higher pattern that I'm not seeing currently. And then when I've done this contemplation, then I can have an insight. I can have access to the logo, to the heart, you can say. And then once I have this insight, I can go back in active mode and do something. So, and again, this is an equilibrium you need, because like if you're always active, sometimes you'll get completely stuck. And even if you don't get completely stuck, sometimes you will miss out on higher level insights that could be very useful. But at the same time, you don't want to be just like a pure thinker and never does anything concrete in the world. You need a balance between being active and the contemplative. And you can see this in a few places in the New Testament where Peter and John work well together. There's even this great episode where after, I think it's Mary Magdalene comes back to the apostles to tell them that the tomb is empty. Then they have this race where like Peter leaves first, he gets passed by John, then John waits, and then Peter arrives. Then at the tomb, he's the one who enters first, and then John enters. Like you have this equilibrium,
back and forth,
between the active and the contemplative. And I think you can see this in the church in general as an equilibrium between the actives and the contemplatives. And again, I think as we contemplate on those stories, then like we do implicit learning, and this will inform then our activity in the world.
No, I don't know if Scott Hand brings it out there, but one of the things that Saint Josemaria used to say is that like the spirit that he was promoting was to do the work of Martha, but with the contemplative spirit of Mary. right? To combine the two sisters, right?
Mhm.
Which is something that anybody in who lives in the middle of the world can try to do that,
Yeah.
right? To try
Yeah.
to combine the two,
Yeah.
so that you do it by trying to offer what you're doing to God, and then trying to do it in a way that will, that will please Him. Which is doing it as best you can, and with a view to taking care of the people around you, and
Mhm.
and all of that, right?
Yeah.
And that's and that there you're uniting the two, right?
Yeah.
You're uniting the. Of course, it's probably a bit more like John and Peter, right? Where sometimes one dominates.
Yeah.
At least in my experience is
Yeah.
kind of like the contemplative will dominate for a bit, but then Peter
Yeah.
catches up, right?
Yeah.
And is a kind of a back and forth between the two.
Yeah.
But there is a way of uniting them, right? Which is again this it's not either or, right? So that either you are a completely active person and all you do is work, or you're a completely contemplative person and you don't do anything, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, like it's a combination of the two, where
Mhm.
you're doing sometimes both at the same time, sometimes more one than the other, but always with a little bit of either contemplation or action involved, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it yeah, and they are not like oil and water, right?
Mhm.
They don't repel one another necessarily,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Yeah.
And again, it takes a lot of finesse because depending on your context, the equilibrium or
Mm-hmm.
the the play between the two will be different.
Yeah.
So obviously, like if let's say you're a young parent with 5 kids, then you're going to be very
Mm-hmm.
active,
Yeah.
and the balance is going to be different from a
Yeah.
monk
Yeah.
who is mostly praying and mostly contemplative,
Yeah.
but who still has to be active from time to time.
Yeah.
Still has like stuff to do, people to talk to, like
Yeah.
he still has to do things in the world.
Yeah.
Like the young parent also needs to pray sometimes. Like
Yeah.
it can't be all action, or you're
Yeah.
gonna lose yourself.
Yeah. Well, the same thing, work can destroy you. I mean, I've seen
Hmm.
people destroyed by, like, eaten up completely by their work, right?
Mhm.
I know some professors like that, where
Mhm.
all they do, right, is 7 days a week, 365 days a year,
Mhm.
almost, is work,
Yeah.
and that eventually ends up eating the person up, right?
Yeah.
Completely. Has a it's a bit like it's like a dragon, if you want, that can completely swallow you,
Mhm.
and make you oblivious to anything else, right?
Yeah.
And even turn you into something which something not quite human in a way, right?
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
you're just you're just in pure action, right? Which is with no and it becomes a kind of it can become a kind of a way of avoiding contemplation too, right? Because you're afraid of it, or you don't know what to do with it, or you don't, right? So like you're active, and then as soon as you feel uneasy when you're not doing anything, so you get back.
Yeah.
Right? It's, it's like a vicious circle, right? Where
Yeah.
you're going all the time, right?
Yeah.
And I think all of us know some people like that, right?
Yeah.
Which
There's
is,
a
yeah.
there's a few interesting things that An mentions about this in the book, where like, he gives a good example of, I think it was the US Army in World War II, where like they had different factories that they required certain quotas from. And like many factories tried to operate 7 days a week, and they weren't able to make their quotas. The only ones that were able to make their quotas were the ones who stopped on Sunday.
Mm,
Um, and it seems to have to
mm,
do with like what you mentioned, where if you like, I think again we can talk about implicit learning here. Like if you're in a world where you work every single
mm-hmm,
day, you
mm-hmm,
don't take time to contemplate like
mm-hmm,
one day in the week,
mm-hmm.
it's going to be harder to contemplate in general.
Yeah,
Like you're going to be much more likely when you're doing your daily
yeah,
work
yeah,
to try not to contemplate at all.
yeah,
And you're going to miss out on opportunities
yeah,
to take a higher perspective
yeah,
that would save you a lot of trouble down
yeah,
the line.
yeah, yeah.
And it's another thing that An mentions about this is like the daily prayer schedule that he follows. And it's pretty daunting for someone coming from the outside.
Mm-hmm,
And he mentions, like interestingly, that what happens in practice as he in his example, he followed it. He noticed that time would sort of appear throughout his day. Like he had to do this progressively, because I would have to find it again. I don't think it would take me that long, but there's maybe like 11 prayer moments during the day. And maybe you can tell me, like, and also, like, it probably takes like 2.5 hours, maybe, if you add up all the time.
Half an hour of mental prayer in the morning, mass, half an hour mental prayer in the evening or afternoon, the rosary, 15 minutes of spiritual reading, visit to the Blessed Sacrament. No, it adds up. But,
it's a
remember
long
that.
schedule. So, I have it now.
Yeah.
So morning offering, mental prayer, 10 minutes, mass, angelus, rosary, spiritual reading, some small act of penance, short visit to the tabernacle, the preces, examination of conscience, 3 Hail Marys at bedtime, and then sign of the cross with holy water. So it's quite a list of things. But like what he explained was that by having those contemplative moments like booked in his day, that he would notice like an equilibrium happening throughout his day, where like he was like the balance between the active and the contemplative would seep into everything he was doing. So when he was working, he also had part of himself which was still contemplating, and what he was doing would fit in a higher story, you can say. He would have better ideas for what to do concretely. He would feel happier. He would feel connected to something higher. So like he had this great unity between work and prayer, between the active and the contemplative.
Yeah. No, that's because one of the dangers is like that people go to mass on Sunday, so you have 1 hour a week, and then never or practically never think of God the rest of the time, right? Maybe once in the morning, once in the evening, or whatever. Like there's not much contemplation involved in that, right? You don't have and so the Martha takes over, right? And you're practically running all the time. When I remember reading this recently, that like one of the things that people are always complaining about is they don't have enough time, right, to do what they would like to do. Well, with all the technology and the time-saving devices and the things that we have, how is it that, that we don't have that people feel that they don't have time, right, to well, I think part of it is lack. Well, then they don't have a contemplative spirit, right? Where you realize that it also helps to relativize things. Where well, if I don't get this done now, right? Well, this is not detrimental to the glory of God, right? It's a personal objective that I set. And it's great if I meet it, but like if I've been doing my best and trying to do things well, if I don't, well, that's great, right? And even the fact of not meeting, I mean, personally for me, the fact of not meeting like an objective is a little sacrifice that I can offer, right? Because I'm the kind of person who like to finish things, right? Then move on to the next thing, right? So no, like it turns everything into a kind of a mini dialogue with God. And in fact, it makes, well, what was it? Benedict XVI that said, like, God doesn't come to take things away from us. He comes to make things even better, right? And so, like, giving this time, it looks like you're giving up time, but you're actually like giving yourself the conditions to be able to contemplate on what you're doing. And you become much more, like, you perform much better, right? Because you're not just spinning your wheels all the time, right? You're connected, right?
You give yourself the ability to take higher level perspectives. You get better at doing this. So in general, like, you will be much more likely to step back from situations, reassess if you need to. Like you said about relativizing, like if you fail at something, you'll be less likely to just freak out, and you'll be more likely to take a higher perspective, like detach a bit from the situation, look at it from higher. Okay, well, this didn't work. Like, do I have other ideas? Like, do I really need to do this? Like, can I just shift to something else? And in our society, if we don't practice with explicit times to take higher perspective, then we lose the ability to do it really well. So yeah, that's like, so already I think if you take just like those patterns, the left and the right, the active and the contemplative, like you can try to map it to any activity that you're doing. Like you're always balancing exploration versus structuring, and also action versus contemplation.
It makes me think of something that was it Jonathan in the where you're talking about the like grasping the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which was, and I think it was Jonathan's talk a couple of weeks ago, and you're saying that there's some fathers of the church who think that God would have eventually given this fruit to Adam and Eve once they were ready for it, but they wanted it immediately, right? So it's this problem of like losing perspective on things where you want the immediate, right? And if you don't have the contemplative spirit, then that's a constant like a constant risk where you're just going for the immediate, and you lose the higher perspective, which is why do I want this, right? Is it really right? Is it really the right thing or the good thing for me at this particular moment? And if you don't have a bit of perspective, well, you can't even ask yourself that question, right? So you're just grasping, right? And grabbing and well, where does that lead?
It's already a kind of fall.
And
like related also to action and contemplation, there's another, I think, very concrete application of symbolism, is that I think you get better at framing situations in terms of their different layers. This is something that like Christ connects like all layers of reality together ultimately. So when you read these stories, you can see how he's connecting heaven and earth. He's connecting the different apostles together into one church. So you can see in the ways that he acts, how it is that you can bring things together and how different layers can coexist. So let's see, maybe the clearest example is how he washes the apostles' feet. So it turns out that in any organization, if you wanted to survive, the person in charge has to like still be the chief of the situation, but sacrifice himself for his subjects. If he tries to just be a tyrant, then like it's gonna crush the ideas, the initiative of the people under him, and ultimately the organization is gonna solidify, and it's gonna get passed by more nimble organization that favor like the emergence of new ideas. But conversely, like if you try to just flatten the hierarchy and have no chief in the organization, then you're gonna have no structure at all, and you're just gonna like be destroyed by organizations that are more organized. So it's something that we do even in the church very concretely. Like during the normal year, like the priest is the one leading the celebration. But once a year we do the washing of the feet, where the priest washes the feet of everyone. And like throughout the year, actually, like you'll see that concretely outside of the liturgy, the priest serves the different people. There's even more interesting stuff we could say about what happens in the liturgy, where the priest is still in a way like serving everyone by feeding them the Eucharist. So there's this balance that you can see in how a leader leads an organization by not crushing everyone, so not in excess of the right thing, you could say, and also by not just letting everyone loose, so that would be an excess of the left end. So Jesus is able to like make it so that a group of people is also one thing. So how like something can be multiple at one level and one at another level. And I think that if you like notice how Jesus does this in the Gospels, then you're going to be able to apply it also in other situations of your life where you have to navigate different levels of patterns. So like it's obvious in a team if like you have to lead a team, or even if you're being led in a team, like you'll know how to act with a good leader. You'll know how to like suggest things to a bad leader if you're with a bad leader. But I think even if you're doing like something as mundane as programming, you still have to connect different layers of things together. You have to think, okay, well, I have a client who like has some goal, some purpose that they want. So I have to create a product that that person will want. And like to create that product, then I need to create like these many chunks of code, for instance, and then to create any one of those, I need to create these lines. So like there's different layers involved in all those things. And if you are used to thinking hierarchically through symbolism, and especially through the very like refined symbolism that you find in the Bible, then it's gonna be easier for you, I think, to see the different layers in any given situation. If let's say I have to code something, then I think I'm going to be better able to step back from what I'm doing and say, well, okay, I say I could be doing this, but if I think back about the level of the client wanting something, maybe I should be doing this thing differently. So I think I can like bring all of the abstract symbolism of, let's say, the left, the right, heaven, earth, the active, the contemplative. I can bring all of that abstract stuff and apply it very concretely when I'm doing my ordinary job.
Of course, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Because there are all kinds of levels that are, you're programming code, you're building an interface. This is for a client who wants to use it for their customers, and so you're doing a service for other people through very, very indirectly, and then ultimately this is a way of adoring God, right? Using the talents that He gave you for the good of other people, and a way of manifesting His intelligence and making a wonderful human being who can program like you. So there's a lot of things that are going on there. And one of the things you said made me think of the Trinity, right? Where you have this this combination between unity and unity with a difference, but that does not the difference does not negatively impact the unity, right? And the unity doesn't destroy the difference, right? I mean, Christianity is kind of unique in well, well, this has been revealed. It's not something that we discovered, right? But in this, where you see this ability to reconcile things, right? It's inherent in the nature of God Himself, as He has revealed Himself, right? So yeah, it's really something you can apply in many different. It sounds like very ethereal and very abstract, but it has. Well, it's a bit like the universal is present in each and every particular, right? And it's what allows you to understand that particular, because it was just a complete, utter particular, you couldn't understand anything about it, right? But if it wasn't instantiated, you could, at least we couldn't grasp it per se, right? So you have this the ability to reconcile different levels. I think it's very important, right? Because if you're just staying on the what happens if you're not aware of this is you tend to stay on just on one level, right? And that is, well, first of all, it's boring, right? Because there's no variety or no, and then it's also meaningless, right? Because, well, particularly if you're on one of the lower levels, like I'm a programmer, I just write code, right? Well, like, that's not very, where's the meaning in that, right? So you see that, okay, this code is going into an interface which is going to allow, I don't know, doctors to treat their patients better. Well, wow, that gives meaning to what you're doing at this lower level, right? You see, but if you're unable to see the levels and the connections between them, well, it just becomes like mechanical and like assembly line work, right? Which is I think that's one of the challenges that they find with assembly line workers, right? Which is trying to keeping them motivated so that they do a good job, because mechanization has that risk, right? That you have to break things down to make them sort of manageable, but if you don't reintegrate them back into the whole, well, then you lose the meaning.
And
Yeah.
also like you're less likely to have higher level insights. Like if you're working in an assembly line, then like the assembly line workers are not going to be able to provide a lot of new ideas because they don't have a very high level view. Like even if they want to have a higher level view, they're not going to have very much of a higher level view. If at least like people can do different parts of the business, then they could have ideas on how to speed up different things and how to combine ideas and so on. So yeah, like the Christianity is very special in its ability to like start from things that look very counterintuitive. And then once you've got this, then you can unlock so many things that it becomes its own kind of justification for the thing that looked unexplainable. Like, well, it is unexplainable. Like you can't explain the Trinity, but if you start with the Trinity, then you can solve the problem of the one and the many. You can understand how different layers can exist together and not try to collapse them together. Christianity is really good at avoiding those extremes, avoiding like being just left hand or just right hand, being just active or just contemplative, being just heaven or just earth, which isn't the case for all like, thought systems. Many thought systems will tend to go into one or the other in more or less naive ways. Like today, there's also people who are just like in politics, like just left hand or just right hand. There's some religions that are just contemplative, where action is not seen as good in itself at all. But yeah, Christianity, just as you said with Chesterton, like is always a both end. Like always, both of those things can be good. You just need the finesse to do them together. And the ultimate example we have is Christ, who like assembled all of those opposites together into one story. So all of the patterns that we can glean from this story should like bear fruit in any given instantiation, any place where we can bring them.
Yeah, we have a story again. It's interesting. There you have just another example of that with Christ. Is you have because I just went to the Holy Lands this spring, right? And one of the things that really hit me was like just how local and particular Christ's life was, right? I mean, the territory that he covered, you can cover in a car in one day, right? Like all of it. And he's born in this particular place. Like he was here, and it's so very particular and so very local. And it made me think, well, like this is very much like my life, right? Like Canadian, right? And you know, I've been to certain places, but most of our lives are very local. They're very rooted in a particular place, right? So you have this particularity, but at the same time, this is universal. Right? This is the Son of God who is redeeming all of mankind with this very, very particular life and this very, very particular actions, right? So I think it's a beautiful example of this reconciliation between, in this case, between the very local, the particular, and the universal, right? That come together in Christ, right? And that's like Christianity. That's it, right? It's a union of these. Well, you know, that's one of the dimensions of it, right?
That's true.
But they're not in contradiction with one another, right? Because the universal is contained in the particular, and the particular is kind of in the universal, right? They're it brings this cosmic event like very close to us, right? Into terms that correspond to our lives and are quite comprehensible to us, right?
You can have like cosmic meaning in a very precise story that takes 33 years and that looks very like boring and finite if you look at it from this way. But Christianity takes both of those together. Infinite meaning and something very precise, very concrete. Very limited seemingly.
No, that's the beauty and the mystery of it.
I think that's a good place to end.
Yes, it would be. I think yes.
Supper,
it is getting time. My stomach is starting to growl.
Well, thanks for doing this. It was really fun. I've been really valuing those conversations. I can feel them like when I'm doing my concrete work and making it more meaningful and hopefully more fruitful too. So yeah, I've been enjoying everyone I've been able to speak with. So
good, cool, right, nice.